Ever tried to inject a little festive cheer into your life, only to have a guy named Richard threaten to put a lien on your house over a plastic pine cone? Yeah. Welcome to the Shady Pines Homeowners Association in Savannah, Georgia. It is a neighborhood where the grass is impossibly green, the Spanish moss hangs from the live oaks like expensive drapery, and the residents are mostly just seeing red. I moved here thinking I was buying a slice of Southern comfort. Instead, I bought a front-row ticket to a bureaucratic dictatorship. Let me paint a picture of my living situation. Shady Pines is the kind of place where your mailbox has to be painted one of 3 pre-approved shades of historic beige. If your trash cans are visible from the street for more than 12 minutes after the garbage truck rolls by, you get a sternly worded email. And ruling over this pristine, sterile kingdom is Richard. Richard is the HOA President. He is a man who wears khaki shorts in December, tucks in his polo shirts so tightly I am amazed he can breathe, and patrols the neighborhood in a customized easy-go golf cart equipped with a radar gun and a clipboard mount. I am not making this up. He literally measures the distance between driveway pavers. Our story begins on a perfectly pleasant Tuesday afternoon in early December. I was feeling the holiday spirit. I had just gone to the local big box hardware store and purchased a wreath for my front door. It was not a crazy wreath. It did not flash neon colors. It did not play annoying MIDI versions of Jingle Bells. It was just a classic, circular arrangement of faux evergreen branches, adorned with a few frosted plastic pine cones, some fake red berries, and a slightly off-center velvet bow. It cost me exactly $19.99. It brought me a disproportionate amount of joy. I took a hammer, tapped a small brass nail into my solid wood front door, and hung the wreath. I stepped back. I admired it. It looked great. It was festive. It was completely harmless. 34 minutes later, I heard the distinctive, high-pitched electric whine of Richard's golf cart stopping at the end of my driveway. I watched through the front window blinds. Richard stepped out. He did not walk up my driveway. He marched. He marched with the righteous indignation of a man who has just spotted a heinous crime against humanity. He marched right up to my porch, pulled a pair of reading glasses down to the bridge of his nose, and glared at my $19 wreath as if it had personally insulted his ancestors. I opened the door before he could knock. "Hey, Richard," I said, leaning against the doorframe. "Beautiful day, right?" Richard did not look at me. His eyes were locked on the plastic pine cones. "This," he declared, pointing a trembling, manicured finger at my door, "is an unauthorized exterior modification. It's a wreath, Richard. It's December." "It is a violation," he snapped, whipping a freshly printed, fully laminated piece of paper off his clipboard and shoving it into my chest. "You are in direct violation of Section 4, Subsection B of the Shady Pines Covenants, Conditions and Restrictions." I looked down at the paper. He had highlighted a paragraph in aggressive neon pink ink. "Read it," he demanded. I cleared my throat and read aloud. "All exterior botanical decorations must consist exclusively of live flora indigenous to the coastal Georgia region to maintain neighborhood aesthetic." I looked back up at him. "Are you kidding me?" "I never kid about the CC&Rs, Richard said, his voice dropping an octave. "This neighborhood maintains a strict historical and natural aesthetic. We do not tolerate tacky, imported plastic garbage. You have 24 hours to remove this hazard." "Hazard? It's foam and wire, man. It's not going to attack anyone." 24 hours, Richard repeated, adjusting his belt. or the board will impose a $500 daily fine until the violation is rectified, and we will put a lien on your property if you refuse to pay. Have a blessed day." He turned on his heel, marched back down my driveway, climbed into his golf cart, and sped off at exactly 14 miles per hour. I stood on my porch for a long time. I looked at the little plastic pine cones. I looked at the pink highlighted text on the laminated citation. I could have just taken the wreath down, tossed it in the garage, and lived my life. Most people would have. It is the path of least resistance. But I did not get mad. I got petty. I took the wreath down. I brought it inside. I set it gently on my kitchen island. Then I opened my laptop, cracked my knuckles, and started a fresh pot of coffee. If Richard wanted to play the legal compliance game, we were going to play it to the absolute limits of the English language. I spent the next 6 hours deep in the trenches of municipal codes, HOA bylaws, and state agricultural databases. I read all 84 pages of the Shady Pines CC and Rs. I scrutinized every single comma in bylaw 4B. All exterior botanical decorations must consist exclusively of live flora indigenous to the coastal Georgia region. The rule was incredibly specific. It did not say the flora had to be pretty. It did not say the flora had to be harmless. It did not say the flora had to be purchased from a licensed florist. It just had to be alive. And it had to be indigenous to coastal Georgia. I opened a new tab and navigated to the Georgia Department of Natural Resources website. I pulled up their official, comprehensive database of indigenous plant species for the coastal plains. I scrolled past the live oaks, the saw palmettos, the sweetgrass, and the magnolia trees. I was looking for something special, something robust, something that screamed, "Merry Christmas, Richard. Keep your hands off my property." And then I found it. Toxicodendron radicans, eastern poison ivy. It grows naturally in every single county in Georgia. It thrives in the coastal humidity. It is a hardy, vine-like plant that stays vibrant green for most of the year. And, fun fact, in the winter months, it produces lovely little clusters of white berries. It is, by every legal and scientific definition, live flora indigenous to the coastal Georgia region. It is also covered in urushiol oil, a remarkably persistent organic allergen that causes severe, weeping, agonizing rashes on contact with human skin. A slow, terrifying smile spread across my face. The loophole was perfect. If I hung a wreath made entirely of poison ivy, I would be 100% compliant with bylaw 4B. But I could not just go out and pick it myself. For one, I am highly allergic. For two, weaving vines into a perfect circle requires a level of botanical craftsmanship I simply do not possess. I needed a professional. I needed a mercenary. I hit the local online classifieds. I searched for brush clearing, swamp drainage, and feral hog removal. I figured anyone doing that kind of work wouldn't be afraid of a little spicy foliage. That is how I found Swampy Pete. Pete's advertisement was just a blurry photo of a chainsaw and a phone number with the caption, "I cut down what you are scared of." I called the number. A man answered on the fourth ring over the sound of a roaring diesel engine. "Yeah? Hi, is this Pete?" "Depends who's asking." "I'm a homeowner in Shady Pines. I have a highly specialized, very weird landscaping job, and I have cash." The engine noise in the background cut out. "I'm listening." Pete pulled into my driveway the next morning. His truck was a battered primer gray Ford F250 that looked like it had survived a war with a mudslide. Pete stepped out. He was wearing heavy canvas overalls, steel-toed boots, and a baseball cap stained with sweat and engine grease. He had a thick, wiry beard and a look of permanent skepticism. He walked up to the porch, sizing me up. "You the guy with the weird job?" "I am," I said, offering my hand. He didn't shake it. He just looked at the neighborhood, eyeing the perfectly trimmed hedges and the identical mailboxes. "I hate this place. Place gives me the creeps. Too clean. What do you need cut down?" "I don't need anything cut down, Pete. I need something built." I gestured for him to follow me to the backyard, away from the prying eyes of the street. We stood on my patio. I took a deep breath and... "Pete, I need you to harvest some live vines and weave them into a standard circular holiday door wreath, about 2 feet in diameter. Nice and thick." Pete stared at me. "You called me out here to do arts and crafts?" "It's what the wreath is made of that matters," I said. "I need you to make it out of toxicodendron radicans." Pete squinted. "Boy, I ain't a botanist. Speak English." "Poison ivy, Pete. I need you to carefully weave a circle out of live, indigenous, highly toxic poison ivy. The 3-leaf special. Try to keep the white berries intact. They add a nice pop of color for the holidays." Pete scratched his beard. He looked at me for a long, quiet moment. He looked at my perfectly normal house. He looked back at me. "Son," he said softly, "you got demons." "I have an HOA, I corrected. "Same difference." A slow, crooked grin broke through Pete's beard. "Who you trying to kill?" "Nobody. I'm just strictly complying with a neighborhood bylaw regarding indigenous exterior decorations. The HOA President is very particular about it. I want to make sure my door decor is authentic to the region." Pete chuckled, a low rumbling sound that sounded like rocks in a blender. "That's diabolical. I respect it. But handling that much urushiol oil without mangling the vines? That requires precision. That requires specialized gear. I gotta wear a hazmat suit, heavy rubber gloves, respirators. It ain't cheap." "Name your price." $300, cash up front. And I ain't hanging it for you. I'm dropping it on your porch in a sealed plastic bin and washing my hands of the whole affair." "Deal," I said. While Pete went off to the marshlands to harvest the devil's garland, I had to cover my own legal bases. Sovereign ruling isn't just about malice, it is about compliance. It is about building an impenetrable fortress of legality around your petty revenge. If I knowingly placed a biological hazard on my front door, a space accessible to delivery drivers, mail carriers, and uninvited HOA presidents, I was opening myself up to massive premises liability. If the mailman bumped into it and got a rash, he could sue me. If a Girl Scout selling cookies touched it, I was done for. I needed to invoke OSHA's General Duty Clause principles and strict liability warnings. I needed to make the hazard so blatantly obvious that any contact with the wreath would legally constitute assumption of risk by the trespasser. I drove to the local office supply store. I bought the thickest, brightest, most obnoxious hazard yellow cardstock they sold. I bought a heavy-duty laminator. I bought zip ties. Back home, I opened a word processor and typed up the most aggressive warning labels I could legally devise. I didn't mince words. I didn't try to be cute. Danger. Botanical security device. Display. Contains live toxicodendron radicans. Poison ivy. Extreme allergen. Do not touch. Do not approach. Property owner assumes no liability for allergic dermatitis, medical bills, or property damage resulting from unauthorized contact. Proceed at your own risk. I printed out 6 copies. I laminated all of them. I took a drill and installed 2 tall wooden stakes into the flower beds flanking the left and right sides of my front porch steps. I zip-tied the massive yellow signs to the stakes. I taped one directly to the glass of my front window, right next to the door. I taped another to the porch railing. My front entryway looked like a quarantined biohazard zone. It looked absolutely insane. It was beautiful. At 4 p.m., Pete's truck rolled back into my driveway. He didn't step out of the cab right away. First, a leg emerged, clad in a bright yellow, heavy-duty Tyvek hazmat suit. Then the rest of him followed, wearing a respirator mask and thick black chemical handling gloves. He walked to the bed of his truck, reached in, and carefully lifted a large, clear plastic storage bin. He waddled up my driveway, looking like an astronaut lost in the suburbs. A few neighbors walking their golden retrievers stopped dead in their tracks, staring in absolute bewilderment. Pete reached the porch. He set the bin down gently. He pulled down his respirator mask. He was sweating profusely. "The deed is done," he announced, breathing heavy. "It is thick. It is juicy. The vines are weeping oil as we speak. I even wove some extra vines across the back so it holds its shape. Do not touch this thing with your bare hands, kid. Seriously, it will send you to the hospital." "I have tongs," I assured him. I handed him an envelope with 3 crisp $100 bills. Pete took the money with his massive black rubber gloves. He looked at the warning signs I had posted everywhere. He read them slowly. He looked at me, shook his head in a mixture of awe and terror, and walked back to his truck. "You're a sick man. Call me if you ever need a moat filled with alligators." He drove away. I stood on my porch, alone with the bin. I took a deep breath of the humid savannah air. I went into the kitchen and retrieved my heavy-duty metal BBQ tongs, the ones with the extra-long handles. I also put on a pair of thick leather gardening gloves, just in case. I popped the clasps on the plastic bin and lifted the lid. It was a masterpiece. Pete had truly outdone himself. The wreath was incredibly lush, perfectly round, and intricately woven. The iconic 3-leaf clusters were vibrant, glossy, and terrifyingly fresh. Little clusters of white berries were expertly tucked into the folds. To the untrained eye from 20 feet away, it just looked like a rustic, earthy, organic holiday decoration. Up close, it looked like a biological weapon. Using the massive metal tongs, I carefully gripped the top of the wreath. I lifted it out of the fin. It was heavy. The vines were thick and sappy. I held it at arm's length, walked up to my front door, and carefully hooked it onto the brass nail. I stepped back. I adjusted it slightly with the tongs to make sure it hung perfectly straight. It was glorious. The vibrant green of the toxic leaves contrasted sharply with the bright yellow of the hazard signs surrounding it. I took my phone out and snapped several dozen photos from every conceivable angle. I made sure the timestamps were visible. I captured the wreath, the signs, the door, the nail. Then I went back inside, washed my hands with dish soap 3 times just to be safe, and sat down at my laptop. It was time to spring the trap. I opened my email. I drafted a new message to the official Shady Pines HOA Board of Directors email address, making sure to CC Richard's personal email. Subject: Notice of Compliance Regarding Bylaw. 4B, Exterior Botanicals. Dear Richard and the Shady Pines HOA Board, thank you for bringing my recent compliance issue to my attention. I sincerely apologize for the oversight regarding the plastic pine cones. I completely agree that preserving the natural, indigenous aesthetic of our beautiful coastal Georgia community is of the utmost importance. Please be advised that I have completely removed the offending artificial decoration. In its place, and in strict, total compliance with Section 4, subsection B of the C&R-S, I have installed a new holiday wreath. This wreath is constructed of 100% live flora, naturally occurring, harvested locally, and deeply indigenous to the coastal Georgia region. Due to the specific biological nature of this indigenous plant, I have also posted necessary safety placards to protect the neighborhood from any accidental contact. Attached are time-stamped photographs for your records proving my compliance well within the 24-hour deadline. Happy holidays, and I look forward to your prompt dismissal of my citation. I attached the photos. I clicked send. I closed my laptop. I walked over to the front window. I parted the blinds just a fraction of an inch, creating a perfect viewing slit of the street. And then I waited. The anticipation was electric. I made a sandwich. I ate it while standing at the window. I watched the sun start to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns. At exactly 5:15 p.m., the email notification pinged on my phone. It was a reply from Richard. It was one sentence. "I am coming to inspect this immediately." I smiled. "Come on down, Richard," I whispered to the empty living room. 5 minutes later, the hum of the golf cart echoed down the street. Richard took the corner a little too fast, the tires squeaking against the asphalt. He slammed on the brakes at the end of my driveway, hopped out, clipboard in hand, and began his furious march up the concrete. He didn't make it to the porch. He stopped dead in his tracks about 10 feet away when he saw the first massive yellow hazard sign. He froze. His eyes darted from the sign on the left stake to the sign on the right stake, to the sign taped to the window, and finally to the lush green wreath hanging on my door. Even from inside the house, through the double-paned glass, I could see the exact moment his brain processed the shape of the leaves. His face flushed a deep, violent shade of crimson. He dropped his clipboard. It clattered against the driveway. "You have got to be kidding me!" he shrieked, his voice cracking, echoing through the quiet, serene streets of shady pines. I didn't open the door. I just stood behind the blinds, sipping a glass of water, watching the absolute meltdown of a petty tyrant who had just realized he was completely, legally trapped by his own rulebook. This was just the beginning. The real chaos hadn't even started yet. I honestly thought his head was going to, literally explode. You know in those old cartoons where the villain's face turns red, steam shoots out of their ears, and a little train whistle sound plays? That was Richard. I mean, he was vibrating. He was standing there in his perfectly pressed khaki shorts, his white New Balance sneakers firmly planted on my driveway, staring at the hazard signs like they had just insulted his mother. I took another sip of my water, leaned a little closer to the blinds, and just basked in it. I guess there is a specific kind of joy that only comes from watching a bully realize they are entirely powerless against their own weaponized bureaucracy. "Take it down," Richard finally screamed, his voice echoing off the perfectly manicured facades of the neighboring houses. A few doors down, Mrs. Gable, who is usually spying on everyone anyway, stepped out onto her porch, pretending to water a fern that was definitely already dead. I decided it was time to make an appearance. I set my glass down, unlocked the deadbolt, and swung the door open, carefully making sure not to brush my shoulder against the botanical security device. I stepped out onto the porch, keeping a very safe 3-foot perimeter between myself and the wreath. "Evening, Richard," I said, leaning against the far porch railing, casually crossing my arms. "I see you got my email. Just wanted to make sure everything was up to code before dinner. Honestly, I think the indigenous flora really pops against the historic beige paint, don't you? Richard's mouth opened and closed a few times before any actual sound came out. He pointed a shaking finger at the wreath. That is a biohazard. That is poison ivy. It is Toxicodendron radicans, Richard, I corrected him, using my best customer service voice. A beautiful, live, indigenous vine, totally native to the coastal Georgia region. I mean, I looked it up on the Department of Natural Resources website and everything. I'm just trying to be a good neighbor. I wouldn't want to violate Bylaw 4B and ruin the aesthetic of shady pines. You are a lunatic, Richard hissed, taking a half-step forward before glancing at the massive yellow warning sign and immediately stepping back. You did this on purpose. I did what on purpose? Complied with your explicit written directive? I shrugged, giving him an innocent, wide-eyed look. You literally handed me a citation yesterday telling me my decorations had to be live indigenous flora. I guess I just took your feedback to heart. Honestly, I should be thanking you for pushing me to embrace local botany. Take it down immediately, or I am calling the landscaping crew to have it forcibly removed, he threatened, pulling his phone out of his pocket and waving it at me like a wand. And I will bill you for their time, plus a hazard disposal fee. I mean, you can certainly try, Richard, I said, smiling politely. But it's on my private property. And I've clearly posted the necessary strict liability warnings to prevent accidental premises liability. If you authorize someone to trespass on my porch and they get hurt, well, I literally have a sign right there saying I'm not liable for their medical bills. I hope the HOA's insurance policy is up to date. We will see about that, Richard snarled. He aggressively jabbed his thumb into his phone screen, holding the device to his ear. He turned his back to me and began pacing at the end of my driveway, barking orders at whoever was unlucky enough to be on the other end of the line. I didn't move. I just leaned against the railing and waited. This was exactly what I wanted him to do. About 20 minutes later, the heavy rumble of a commercial diesel engine interrupted the quiet suburban evening. A massive white flatbed truck with Coastal Greenery Solutions painted on the side in bold green letters turned the corner and idled in front of my house. The truck had a trailer attached to it, loaded with zero-turn mowers, weed whackers, and leaf blowers. 3 guys in neon yellow safety vests were sitting in the cab. The driver, a broad-shouldered guy with a thick mustache and a pair of mirrored sunglasses, parked the rig, pulled the air brake with a loud pshh, and stepped out. Richard immediately scurried over to him like a frantic little terrier. "Hector, thank goodness," Richard said, practically panting. "I have an emergency violation removal. I need you and your men to clear a localized biological hazard from this property immediately. The homeowner is being completely uncooperative." Hector, the foreman, took off his sunglasses and wiped his forehead with the back of his hand. He looked tired. He looked like a guy who had been out in the Georgia heat for 10 hours and just wanted to go home and drink a cold beer. He did not look like a guy who wanted to deal with Richard's HOA drama. "What's the problem, Mr. Peterson?" Hector asked, his voice a deep, gravelly baritone that commanded instant respect. He walked up the driveway, flanked by his 2 crew members, carrying a pair of heavy-duty loppers. "That," Richard said, pointing dramatically at my front door. He hung a weed on his door, a toxic weed. I need you to bag it, dispose of it, and scrub the doorframe down with bleach. Hector stopped about 15 feet from the porch. He looked at me, leaning against the railing. I gave him a friendly nod. Then his eyes dropped to the bright yellow laminated signs zip-tied to the stakes in my flower beds. He walked a little closer, squinting at the text. His lips moved slightly as he read the warning. Danger. Botanical security device. Display contains live toxicodendron radicans. Hector stopped reading. He looked up at the lush, perfectly woven, glistening green wreath on my door. He looked closer, spotting the distinctive 3-leaf clusters and the little white berries. Hector lowered the loppers so the handles rested on the concrete driveway. He turned to look at Richard. "Mr. Peterson," Hector said slowly, "is that a poison ivy wreath?" "It is a malicious act of defiance, is what it is," Richard sputtered. "Just grab it with your gloves and throw it in the mulcher." "Bro," Hector said, completely dropping his professional contractor voice. "Are you out of your mind?" Richard blinked. "Excuse me?" "You're asking me and my guys to handle a recognized occupational hazard," Hector said, gesturing to the wreath. "That thing is practically sweating urushiol oil. Do you have any idea how potent that is? If we throw that in the wood chipper, it'll aerosolize the oil. It'll blow into the air, we'll breathe it in, and my entire crew will have poison ivy in our lungs. We'd be in the emergency room by midnight." "Just put a trash bag over it," Richard insisted, his voice pitching higher. "You are the contracted landscapers for Shady Pines. I am the president. I am giving you a direct order to rectify this landscaping violation." Hector sighed, a long, deep, exhausted sound. He pinched the bridge of his nose. "Honestly, Mr. Peterson, I don't think you understand how commercial liability works. This isn't trimming an overgrown azalea bush. This is a federal OSHA Section 5A1 violation waiting to happen." I had to bite the inside of my cheek to stop myself from laughing out loud. Hector was a professional. He knew the general duty clause. "Section what?" Richard asked, looking completely lost. "The general duty clause," I chimed in from the porch, unable to help myself. "It requires employers to provide a workplace free from recognized hazards that are causing or are likely to cause death or serious physical harm. I mean, Hector is legally obligated to protect his crew from dangerous biological agents." Hector pointed a thick, calloused finger at me. "The crazy guy on the porch is right. Look, Mr. Peterson, under OSHA regulations, if you want me to authorize my guys to handle highly concentrated toxicodendron radicans, I have to provide them with specialized PPE. I'm talking full Tyvek hazmat suits, chemical-resistant gauntlets, and full-face respirators. I don't carry that stuff in the truck. Furthermore, handling hazardous biological materials requires hazard pay. Standard union rate for urushiol oil exposure is triple time, plus a mandatory paid quarantine day, plus you have to sign a liability waiver releasing my company from any workers' comp claims." Richard's face was rapidly cycling through various shades of pale. "Triple time? Liability waivers? For a weed?" "It's not a weed," Hector corrected him, deadpan. "According to that sign, it's a botanical security device. And honestly, it's a massive lawsuit. If I order my guy to touch that and he gets a systemic rash, he sues me, OSHA fines me, and then my insurance company sues you because you ordered the work. You want to authorize a $5,000 emergency biohazard removal charge for a plant? $5,000? Richard squeaked. "Minimum," Hector said, putting his sunglasses back on. He turned to his crew. "Pack it up, boys. We're not touching this." "You can't just leave," Richard yelled, stepping in front of Hector. "You work for the HOA. I will terminate your landscaping contract. I will find a crew who isn't afraid of a little leaf." Hector looked down at Richard. Hector was at least 6'3" and built like a brick wall. Richard was 5'7" and built like a guy who strictly adheres to the speed limit. "You do that, Mr. Peterson," Hector said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble. "You go find a crew of undocumented guys who don't know their rights, and you force them to handle a toxic biohazard without protection. Let me know how that works out for you when the Department of Labor gets involved. My contract is with the board, not with you personally. You try to terminate me over this, and I'll have my lawyer draft a breach of contract suit so fast it'll make your head spin." Hector stepped around Richard, walked back to his truck, and climbed into the cab. His crew followed, tossing the loppers into the trailer. The diesel engine roared to life, and the truck pulled away, leaving a faint cloud of exhaust in its wake. Richard stood in the driveway, completely isolated. He looked at the retreating truck. He looked at me, standing smugly on the porch. He looked at the wreath. He was losing his mind. He was completely out of options. His threats were useless. His contractors had abandoned him. He was trapped in a cage of his own bureaucratic design. And then, he did the only thing a petty tyrant can do when their authority is challenged and defeated. He decided to escalate it to the people with guns. Richard reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone again, and dialed 3 numbers. I could literally hear the keypad beeps from the porch. 9 1 1. "Yes, hello, police?" Richard said, pacing back and forth on the edge of the asphalt, practically shouting into the receiver. "I need officers dispatched to Shady Pines immediately. I want to report a crime in progress. Yes, biological terrorism. A resident is recklessly endangering the neighborhood with a highly toxic substance. He has weaponized a hazard and is threatening the community. Please, hurry." He hung up, shoved the phone back into his pocket, and glared at me with a look of pure, unadulterated triumph. "You're done," he sneered. "You think you're so smart with your little OSHA rules? You just committed a felony. The police are going to arrest you, and then the city will come and confiscate that biohazard." I honestly couldn't believe it. He actually called the cops over a wreath. I guess I shouldn't have been surprised. When you back a cornered animal into a wall, they lash out. But a cornered HOA President? They call the SWAT team over landscaping. "I'll put on a fresh pot of coffee," I said cheerfully. "You want me to grab you a bottle of water, Richard? It's hot out here, and you're looking a little flushed. I wouldn't want you to pass out before the handcuffs come out." He didn't answer. He just stood there, arms crossed, tapping his foot, glaring at me like a gargoyle on a very boring cathedral. It took about 15 minutes for the Savannah Police Department to arrive. 2 cruisers rolled down the street, their light bars flashing silently. They pulled up along the curb, blocking my driveway. 2 officers stepped out. One was a tall, older guy with a graying mustache and a completely exhausted expression. He looked like he had seen everything the city had to offer and was deeply tired of all of it. His name tag read Officer Miller. The other was a younger, stockier cop who looked a little confused as to why they had been dispatched to the nicest, quietest street in the city for a biological terrorism call. Richard practically sprinted over to them before they even closed their car doors. "Officers! Thank God!" Richard cried, pointing frantically toward my house. "He's up there, on the porch! He planted a toxic biohazard right on his front door. It's a deliberate act of violence against the neighborhood aesthetic and public safety." Officer Miller rested his hand casually on his duty belt and looked from Richard to me to the massive yellow signs and finally to the wreath. He let out a long, slow breath that ruffled his mustache. "Sir," Officer Miller said, looking at Richard, "are you telling me we responded to a Code 3 emergency call for a plant?" "It's not a plant, it's poison ivy! Toxicodendron radicans!" Richard yelled, as if using the Latin name made it a weapon of mass destruction. "It's highly dangerous. He's trying to infect the whole community." Officer Miller and the younger cop walked slowly up the driveway. They stopped a good distance away, right next to where Richard had dropped his clipboard earlier. They both stared at the signs. They both stared at the wreath. I stepped up to the porch railing again, keeping my hands visible. "Good evening, officers," I called out, keeping my tone extremely calm, polite, and reasonable. "Evening," Officer Miller called back. "You the homeowner?" "I am. Can you explain to me why you have a large circle of poison ivy hanging on your front door, and why this gentleman," he gestured to Richard, "is accusing you of biological terrorism?" "Honestly, officer, it's just a misunderstanding over local municipal compliance," I said smoothly. "Mr. Peterson here is the HOA President. Yesterday, he issued me a formal citation stating that my plastic holiday decorations were in violation of the neighborhood bylaws. He specifically demanded, in writing, that all exterior botanical decorations must consist exclusively of live flora indigenous to the coastal Georgia region. He threatened me with a $500 daily fine if I didn't comply within 24 hours. I paused for dramatic effect. I could see the younger cop trying very hard not to smile. "So," I continued, spreading my hands innocently, "I complied. I hired a local contractor to harvest indigenous toxicodendron radicans. It's live, it's local, and it fits the exact letter of the HOA's rule. But because I am a responsible citizen, I also posted extensive, highly visible, strict liability warnings to ensure nobody accidentally touches it and gets a rash. I'm just trying to follow the rules, officer." Officer Miller stared at me. He looked back at Richard. He looked at the wreath again. "Let me get this straight," Miller said, his voice dripping with absolute fatigue. "You," he pointed at Richard, "told him to hang live local plants." "Yes, but—" Richard started. "And you," Miller pointed at me, "complied by hanging the most toxic local plant you could find, just to spite him." "I am simply adhering to the strict historic and natural aesthetic of the community, as requested," I replied, suppressing a grin. Miller took his uniform hat off, ran a hand through his thinning gray hair, and put the hat back on. He looked at his partner. His partner just shrugged. "Sir," Miller said, turning his full attention to Richard, "did you really call 911 and report biological terrorism over a property dispute regarding a weed?" "It is a reckless endangerment of the public," Richard insisted, his face turning red again. "He is creating a public nuisance. Arrest him. Confiscate the hazard." "Mr. Peterson," the younger cop chimed in, stepping forward, "this is private property. That wreath is attached to his private residence. It is clearly labeled with warning signs. He is not throwing it at anyone. He is not forcing anyone to touch it. There is absolutely no crime being committed here." "But it's dangerous!" Richard shrieked. "What if the mail carrier touches it?" "Then that's a civil premises liability issue between the homeowner and the post office," Officer Miller stated firmly. "Which, looking at those signs, he's legally insulated himself against anyway. Furthermore, Mr. Peterson, if you or anyone else attempts to approach that porch and remove that wreath without the homeowner's consent, you will be committing criminal trespass, theft of private property, and potentially vandalism. And if you force someone to take it down and they get injured, you could be civilly liable for assault." Richard looked like he had been slapped in the face with a wet fish. "You're taking his side? He's weaponized a weed." "I'm not taking anyone's side. I'm explaining the law," Miller said, his voice hardening into a strict, no-nonsense command tone. "This is a civil matter. It is an HOA dispute. It is completely outside the jurisdiction of the Savannah Police Department. Do not call 911 for this again, or I will cite you for misuse of the emergency dispatch system. Do we understand each other?" Richard opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked at the cops. He looked at me. He was completely, utterly defeated. "Yes, officer," Richard mumbled, his voice barely a whisper. "Good," Miller said. He turned to me. "Sir, you have a terrible personality. I respect the hustle, but please do not let that thing touch any kids." "Strictly decorative, officer. Have a safe shift." The cops walked back to their cruisers. They got in, turned off their flashing lights, and drove away. The silence that fell over the street was deafening. The sun was starting to set, casting a golden hue over the perfectly manicured lawns, the historic beige mailboxes, and the gleaming, toxic masterpiece hanging on my front door. Richard didn't say another word. He bent down, picked up his clipboard from the driveway, walked slowly back to his golf cart, and climbed in. He didn't even look at me as he reversed and drove away at a very sluggish, defeated 7 miles per hour. I went back inside and locked the deadbolt. I had won the battle. The contractors had retreated. The police had validated my legal standing. Richard was humiliated. But I knew Richard. Petty tyrants don't just give up. They regroup. They find a new angle. He couldn't force me to take it down physically, and he couldn't use the police to arrest me. That left only one avenue of attack: the HOA Board of Directors. He was going to try to change the rules. He was going to try to hold an emergency meeting, amend the bylaws, and specifically outlaw my botanical security device. And I was banking on exactly that, because while Richard had spent the afternoon throwing a temper tantrum on my driveway, I had spent my time doing a little more research. I had looked up the public property records for Richard's house. I had pulled up Google Street View. I had cross-referenced the landscaping on his property with the Georgia Department of Agriculture's database. And I had found the ultimate nuclear option: the checkmate. When the emergency board meeting notice was slipped into my mailbox the very next morning, demanding my presence at the clubhouse that evening, I didn't panic. I just smiled, grabbed my laminator, and prepared to dismantle the entire kingdom of Shady Pines. Honestly, the Shady Pines clubhouse is exactly what you would expect a neighborhood dictatorship's headquarters to look like. I mean, it is literally just a glorified, oversized living room that smells permanently like chlorine from the community pool and cheap, burnt drip coffee. It has these terrible floral curtains that I guess someone in 1998 thought looked classy, and a long mahogany table right in the center where the board of directors sits, looking down at the residents like they are the supreme court of lawn care. I walked into the clubhouse at exactly 6:58 p.m. for the 7 p.m. emergency meeting. I was holding a thick manila folder tucked under my arm. I was wearing a nice button-down shirt because, if you are going to dismantle a man's entire ego in public, you should at least dress for the occasion. The room was surprisingly packed. Word had gotten around about the poison ivy wreath. I mean, suburban gossip travels faster than light, and half the neighborhood was sitting in those cheap folding chairs, murmuring and pointing when I walked in. Sitting at the head of the mahogany table was Richard. He had on a fresh, crisply ironed polo shirt, and he was gripping a wooden gavel like it was Excalibur. To his right was Brenda, the HOA treasurer, a woman who perpetually looked like she had just smelled bad milk. To his left was Gary, the secretary, a guy who honestly just looked terrified to be there at all. I took a seat in the very front row, right in the center, crossing my legs and placing my manila folder neatly on my lap. At exactly 7 p.m., Richard slammed the gavel down on a little wooden block. The sharp crack echoed through the room, silencing the whispers. "I call this emergency meeting of the Shady Pines Homeowners Association Board of Directors to order," Richard announced, puffing his chest out. He glared directly at me. "We are here tonight to address a severe, unprecedented, and malicious threat to the safety and aesthetic integrity of our community." I just smiled politely and gave him a little wave. He tightened his grip on the gavel. "As many of you know," Richard continued, pacing his words for maximum dramatic effect, A resident has intentionally affixed a massive arrangement of highly toxic toxicodendron radicans, commonly known as poison ivy, to their front door. This resident is attempting to exploit a loophole in our neighborhood, bylaws to justify this reckless endangerment of our children, our pets, and our property values. Brenda let out a loud, theatrical gasp. A few people in the back row muttered in agreement. Therefore, Richard said, pulling a piece of paper from his pristine folder, I am proposing an immediate emergency amendment to Section 4, subsection B, of the Shady Pines Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions. The new text will read, all exterior botanical decorations must consist exclusively of live flora indigenous to the coastal Georgia region and must explicitly exclude any toxic, noxious, allergenic, or otherwise harmful plant species, subject to immediate removal by the board at the homeowner's expense. He looked around the room, a smug, victorious grin plastered across his face. He thought he had me. He thought he had closed the loophole, won the war, and successfully legislated me into a corner. I motion to bring this amendment to an immediate vote, Richard declared. I second the motion, Brenda chimed in quickly, not even looking up from her notepad. Before we vote, I said, standing up slowly. My voice was calm, steady, and cut through the tension in the room like a knife. As a dues-paying member of this association, I believe I have the right to the floor during the open discussion period regarding any new amendments. Isn't that right, Gary? Gary jumped slightly in his chair, adjusting his glasses. He frantically flipped through a thick binder of bylaws. Yes. Yes, according to Section 8. Subsection A, any resident in good standing may speak for up to 5 minutes on a proposed amendment before a vote is cast. Richard's face flushed red, but he forced a tight, pained smile. Fine. You have 5 minutes. Make it quick. Although, honestly, I don't see what you could possibly say to defend a biohazard. I walked up to the front, standing just a few feet away from the mahogany table. I looked out at the crowd, then back at the board. I guess I just want to make sure we are all fully, entirely clear on the wording of the existing rule and the standards we hold our community to, I said, opening my manila folder. Richard, could you please read the exact text of Bylaw 4B as it currently stands, the one you cited me for yesterday? Richard rolled his eyes. We all know what it says. For the public record, please, I insisted, tapping my finger on the table. Richard sighed heavily. He picked up his original citation copy. All exterior botanical decorations must consist exclusively of live flora indigenous to the coastal Georgia region to maintain neighborhood aesthetic. There. Happy? Very, I said. Indigenous to the coastal Georgia region, meaning native, naturally occurring in this specific ecosystem, not imported from Europe, or Asia, or somewhere else, correct? Obviously, Richard snapped. That is the entire point of the rule. We protect the local ecosystem. And you, as the president of this HOA, hold yourself to that exact same strict standard, right? I asked, tilting my head. I mean, you wouldn't enforce a rule on me with a $500 daily fine if you were actively violating it yourself. That would be wildly hypocritical. It would literally be an abuse of power. Richard scoffed, leaning back in his chair. My property is in pristine condition. It has won Yard of the Month for 4 consecutive years. I am in total compliance with every single letter of the CC and Rs. Are you sure about that? I asked softly. I reached into the manila folder and pulled out a stack of high-resolution, full-color, 8x10 glossy photographs. I handed one to Richard, one to Brenda, and one to Gary. Then I turned and handed a few copies to the people sitting in the front row, gesturing for them to pass the photos back. "What is this?" Richard demanded, staring at the photo in his hand. "That is a very lovely, very clear picture of the front facade of your house, Richard," I said, my voice echoing in the silent room. "Specifically, it is a detailed close-up of the beautiful, thick, cascading green vines that completely cover the brickwork around your front door, your bay windows, and your entire front retaining wall. It is a stunning display of landscaping. Honestly, it must have taken years to grow that thick." "It's English ivy," Richard said proudly, jutting his chin out. "It gives the property a stately, historic, traditional manor aesthetic. It is highly sought after." "It is," I agreed, nodding, enthusiastically. "It's gorgeous. But, as the name implies, English ivy, scientifically known as Hedera helix, is native to Europe and Western Asia. It is emphatically, undeniably, 100% not indigenous to the coastal Georgia region." The room suddenly went deathly quiet. You could literally hear the hum of the terrible fluorescent lights overhead. Richard's smug smile faltered. "What?" I reached into my folder again. "Furthermore," I continued, pulling out a thick, officially stamped document featuring the state seal, "according to the Georgia Forestry Commission and the Department of Agriculture, Hedera helix is officially classified as a Category 1 invasive species. It chokes out native flora. It damages brickwork. It is an aggressive, destructive, non-native weed. It is actively harmful to the local ecosystem." I slid the state document across the table. It stopped right in front of Richard's gavel. "You cited me under bylaw 4B for having a plastic pine cone," I said, raising my voice just enough to ensure the entire room heard every single word. "A rule that dictates all exterior botanicals must be exclusively indigenous. Meanwhile, the president of the HOA has his entire home completely smothered in an invasive foreign species of ivy. Which means, Richard, you are currently in massive structural violation of your own bylaw." Gary, the secretary, physically recoiled from Richard, looking at him like he had just admitted to a crime. That is different," Richard stammered, his face turning a deep, blotchy purple. "That ivy was planted years ago. It is grandfathered in." "I literally read the CC and RS cover to cover last night," I fired back, leaning over the table, planting both my hands firmly on the mahogany. "There is no grandfather clause in Section 4. There is no statute of limitations on aesthetic violations. A violation is a violation. And according to the citation you handed me, the penalty for an unauthorized non-indigenous exterior botanical modification is a $500 daily fine." I pulled a small black calculator out of my pocket. I tapped the keys loudly. The click, click, click was the only sound in the room. "Let's see," I mused aloud. "You've been president for 4 years. The ivy has been there the whole time. 4 years is 1,460 days. Multiply that by $500 a day. Wow. That comes out to exactly $730,000 in accrued HOA fines. Plus, I imagine, the cost of hiring a specialized abatement crew to safely tear all that invasive ivy off your brickwork, which, based on my recent quotes from Coastal Greenery Solutions, isn't going to be cheap." Brenda gasped again, this time putting her hand over her chest. $700,000, she squeaked. "It's a clear violation of the rules, Brenda," I said, turning to the treasurer with a look of deep, faux concern. "As fiduciaries of this association, I guess the board is legally obligated to collect those fines to maintain the community budget. If you fail to enforce the rules equally, the board could be sued for discriminatory enforcement. I mean, my lawyer told me that selective enforcement invalidates the entire HOA charter. If Richard doesn't pay, any resident here could legally stop paying their dues. The crowd erupted. The residents in the folding chairs suddenly realized that their dictator had just been caught completely exposed. People started yelling. "He's right," a guy in the back row shouted. "Fine him," a woman near the front demanded. "He fined me $200 because my hydrangeas were the wrong shade of blue." Richard was hyperventilating. He banged his gavel wildly against the block. "Order! Order! This is absurd! You cannot fine me $700,000! I am the president!" "You're a resident, Richard, and the rules apply to everyone," I said loudly, cutting over the noise. I didn't back down. I just stood there, towering over his seated position, holding the calculator like a weapon. "Or they apply to no one." I waited for the noise to die down slightly. I waited until Richard stopped banging the gavel and looked up at me, his eyes wide, panicked, and desperate. He looked like a man who was watching his entire life's work crumble into dust. "But," I said smoothly, my voice dropping back to a conversational, reasonable tone, "I am not an unreasonable man. I don't want to see you go bankrupt over some invasive weeds, Richard. I want to offer a compromise, a settlement, if you will." Richard swallowed hard. His knuckles were white around the handle of the gavel. "What kind of settlement?" "It's very simple," I said, holding up 3 fingers. 1. The board immediately votes to permanently strike Section 4, subsection B from the Shady Pines CC and Rs, completely erased. Homeowners can decorate their doors however they see fit within the bounds of city law. 2. My citation regarding the plastic pine cones is immediately formally dismissed in writing, with no fines attached. 3. You drop this ridiculous emergency amendment regarding my botanical security device. "And if we refuse?" Brenda asked, her voice shaking slightly. "If you refuse," I said, locking eyes with Richard, "I will formally file this complaint with the board tomorrow morning regarding Richard's invasive English ivy. I will demand the collection of the $730,000 in back fines, and if the board refuses to act, I will file a lawsuit against the HOA for selective enforcement and gross negligence of fiduciary duties. I will also forward this report to the Georgia Department of Agriculture regarding the intentional cultivation of a Category 1 invasive species. It's your call. Honestly, I'm fine either way." I closed my manila folder. I picked up my calculator. I stepped back from the table and crossed my arms. The silence that followed was heavy. It was the sound of complete, absolute defeat. Richard looked at Brenda. Brenda was furiously shaking her head, terrified of the legal liability. He looked at Gary. Gary was practically hiding under the table. He looked out at the crowd of residents, who were all staring back at him with expressions ranging from pure hatred to extreme amusement. He had no allies. He had no leverage. He was trapped in a cage built from his own absurd bylaws. Richard's shoulders slumped. The gavel slipped from his hand and rolled across the table, falling onto the carpeted floor with a dull thud. He let out a long, shuddering breath. "Gary," Richard croaked, his voice devoid of all its former pompous authority. "Record a motion to strike Section 4, subsection B from the bylaws in its entirety, and a motion to dismiss all pending citations related to that section." "I second the motion," Brenda practically yelled, desperately eager to distance herself from the liability. "All in favor?" Richard asked, staring blankly at the mahogany table. "Aye," Brenda said. "Aye," Gary squeaked. "The motion carries," Richard whispered. He didn't even look up at me. He just sat there, staring at the photos of his house, his kingdom completely dismantled. The residents in the folding chairs literally started clapping. A few of them cheered. The tyranny of the shady pines. HOA Aesthetics Committee was officially dead, killed by a guy with a $19 plastic pine cone wreath and a heavy dose of malicious compliance. "Pleasure doing business with you, Richard," I said cheerfully. I turned around and walked down the center aisle of the clubhouse. People were patting me on the back as I passed. I felt like a conquering hero. When I got back to my house, the street was quiet and dark. My porch light illuminated the thick, lush, deeply toxic wreath still hanging on my front door. It looked magnificent. It had served its purpose flawlessly. I went around to the garage, put on my heavy leather welding gloves, grabbed my long metal tongs, and carefully unhooked the poison ivy wreath from the brass nail. I carried it out to the street and placed it gently in the bottom of a heavy-duty trash bin, securing the lid tightly. I would call Swampy Pete in the morning to come dispose of it properly. He earned his hazard pay. Then I went inside, washed my hands with dish soap like 4 times, and walked into my kitchen. Sitting on the island was my original $19 store-bought, totally harmless plastic pine cone wreath. I picked it up, walked back out to the front porch, and hung it proudly on the brass nail. I adjusted the slightly off-center velvet bow. I stepped back to admire it. It was completely unauthorized by any indigenous aesthetic standards. It was tacky, it was cheap, and it was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I guess that is what happens when you try to use the rule book to bully someone who knows how to read the fine print. You push, they push back, and suddenly you are the one facing a massive fine over a climbing vine. If there is one thing I have learned from dealing with petty local tyrants, it is that they never expect you to play their game better than they do. They never expect you to take their ridiculous demands to their absolute, logical, most toxic conclusions. And that is why you always keep your receipts, you always read the bylaws, and you never, ever let a guy in a golf cart tell you what you can put on your own front door. This has been another masterclass in malicious compliance. Keep your records straight, keep your loopholes ready, and never stop fighting the petty tyrants. See you in the next one. This is Sovereign Authority, signing off.